So thanks so much for being here today for our Motivation Beyond Measure Forum this month and talking about good, better, and best practices for employee mental wellness. So first of all, let's talk about the prevalence of unwellness, if you will, right now in the world. So, a recent Harvard Business Review study said that 89% of people, so this is up from a year or so ago, as you might imagine, but the numbers are really staggering. 89% of people say their work lives are in the process of getting worse right now. So they're continuing to worsen. Nine out of 10 people say their work lives are getting worse. So, look at the people maybe that you work with, or look at the people on your staffs, or look at the people that you're talking to, or look at your friends or your neighbors. People who are working right now, 9 out of 10 of them say that their work lives are getting worse. 85% report that their well-being has declined. So it's 85% of people that are in the workforce right now are saying they're less well than they were a year ago or 6 months ago. So these numbers are really staggering, and they're going in obviously a declining direction of where we would like things to go right now. A global leadership forecast report noted that 86% of employees feel used up at the end of the day. 44% of leaders right now are considering leaving their companies that they work for. That's almost half of the leaders that are working for companies right now. And so these are companies that both you probably know and that you don't know. So think about big companies like Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft. And then think of little companies that are around the places that you live. So local or regional companies. What this is really telling us is that the workforce, again, is really stressed right now, and they're looking for a way out of that stress. We're really at a critical moment. Gallup poll saying that 76% of employees experience burnout at work. So this is 3/4 of workers are burned out right now. So it's not just that things are getting worse, that they are about the worst that they're going to get for people, or that at least that people are perceiving right now. Let's look at a Forbes report on mental wellness. This is from this year already. So I think this is pretty interesting. So some of the findings of CEOs. So when Forbes was asking CEOs about mental wellness in their organizations, 80% of CEOs believe that poor employee mental health negatively impacts worker productivity. Okay, so that's pretty cool, right? So eight out of 10 CEOs recognize that when an employee has poor mental health, that it's going to negatively impact the worker's productivity. What I find shocking is, what are the other two CEOs thinking? Right? So there's 20% of CEOs out there, 20% of CEOs that don't believe that when an employee is mentally struggling, that it affects their productivity. Like that disconnect for me is like shocking, and of course when we do this work, right, we really want to work with organizations that want to be beneficial, want to be helpful to the people and the employees that are in their organizations, right? So the 20% of employees that don't believe that mental wellness is an issue probably aren't going to hire any of us or even ask any of us to come in. And maybe that's, I'm not going to say that's okay, but that's just the way that is. I feel horrible for the people that are working in that organization, because this is obviously a significant disconnect. And as we go through some of these statistics, some of them are kind of really interesting in the way when you look at them together. So 80% of CEOs recognize that poor employee mental health negatively impacts that person's productivity. Now, 94% of CEOs report having received mental health support themselves over the past year. So I thought that this was also interesting, because I don't know if they rated or interviews the same CEO groups, but if 80% of CEOs, 80% believe that poor mental health affects productivity, but 94% of CEOs are seeking mental health support themselves, like that's like a little bit obtuse for me, right? That's a weird matching of kind of statistics in that way, that CEOs may be saying, okay, well, but I'm going to seek help for myself, but we don't have to worry about you, maybe, Like maybe you don't have as many problems as I do. I don't know. I'm just kind of surmising in terms of looking at these numbers and working with a lot of people that work with other people and kind of understanding how people think a little bit. So there are a majority of CEOs right now who are saying that, hey, I'm stressed and I need help. We would hope that there'd be a trickle-down effect with that. Maybe not always. Now, more than half of CEOs report that talking about mental health makes them a better leader. And nearly 90% of their employees appreciate it. Now, but here's another interesting statistic. Even though more than half CEOs report that talking about their own mental health makes them a better leader, 56% of them are concerned it might impact their credibility. So there's still a disconnect here. So CEOs are saying, it's important that I talk about it because it makes me a better leader, but at the same time, I'm not going to talk about it because then I'm not credible. So we still kind of are seeing, one of the interesting things I think we've all noticed about the pandemic experience and moving to Zoom conferences is employees are seeing their leaders in their living rooms with their cats and their dogs and their kids and their spouses and all the stuff that they've going on. So in some ways, it has really humanized leaders in organizations. But they're still obviously looking at the stats right here that 56% of leaders are still saying that if I'm too humanized, it might impact my credibility. So there's still a potential disconnect going on here is how human can a leader be and still be credible? I mean, I think that's a whole other topic we could kind of dive into, but what we do know from the statistics that there are some disconnects here. Now, 92% of CEOs report that their companies have increased focus on mental health as a result of the pandemic. Okay, so that's pretty good. So CEOs are saying we're doing things differently. Now, just because the CEOs say it doesn't mean the employees feel it, though. So the employees have a little bit of a different take on this. 48% of employees report experiencing high to extreme stress over the past year. So we've seen this in other statistics. We know that employees are stressed extremely or from high to extreme levels. Now, even though so you think about that last slide we just looked at, even though 96% of CEOs believe that they are doing enough for employee mental wellness, only 69% of employees feel the same way. So there's a 30%, again, disconnect in this. The CEOs say we're doing enough. The employees say we're not doing enough. So what I'm curious about is that gap. Where is that gap? I think it is fascinating when you think about bringing CEOs and employees to the same table and having these really transparent discussions around where's this gap. CEOs say we're doing enough, employees say we need to do more, we're not doing enough. How do we bridge that gap to create really true mental wellness for everyone within our work settings? All right, now the average worker is half as likely as CEOs to say their companies are accepting of mental health issues. Again, so when we look at from the employee's perspective, they say, I'm not being met with my mental health issues. But CEOs are saying, wait, we're meeting you. We accept you, but the employees say we're not feeling accepted. So there's a lot of reasons why that can happen, but obviously it's there. Now, individual contributors report that their companies offer mental health benefits only half as often as CEOs do, okay? So let's look at stress for a second. So we're talking about the extreme sources of extreme stress. We know people are stressed. Now, on one hand, stress is pretty simple. That stress, if we look at the definition of stress, stress is the result of a person's perceived physiological or psychological inability to cope with their current view of reality. So on one hand, stress is pretty simple. On another hand, stress is pretty complex because these physiological and psychological perceptions are being driven from physiological sources, from psychological sources. Stress is emotional. Stress is behavioral. Stress is more than these things, by the way. These are just 8 that I pulled out. Stress is environmental, social, of course, perceptual, and also relational. So the sources of stress, the experiences of stress are multifactored. However, the results are pretty predictable physiologically. So whatever the source is, whether the source is strictly physiological, whether you're being chased by a bear, let's say, or it's psychological, you're in an abusive situation with a boss, coworker, or living situation. They're emotional. You've experienced loss. They're behavioral. You're in a situation where it's very difficult for you to, maybe there's some addiction situations going on. It's difficult to get yourself to do the things that would be really beneficial or mentally well for you. They're environmental. Again, we could be working in not only toxic environments psychologically, but toxic environments toxically. Could be working with toxic substances, paints, thinners, in manufacturing institutions, right? So that can create stress. It can be a social, like look at what's going on right now in the world around the racial divides, police issues, right? We just had a major conviction handed down to a police officer who killed a person of color. So there's a lot of social pressures going on, perceptual and of course relational. Every situation that we have is a source of stress. So stress can be complex, but also it's pretty simple. I love these dynamics that when we talk about this. Let's talk about a couple of ideas around what we call compassion fatigue and burnout. So when we talk about caregivers, so we have some people with us here today who are in the caregiving role, who do this professionally. And so we talk about compassion fatigue. When we're in the work of caring for other people, we know we're in a state of compassion fatigue when we still care, but we really feel overwhelmed. Now, compassion fatigue can also be a precursor to burnout, which we're going to talk about next. So in compassion fatigue, we have increased feelings of fatigue. We're tired, less empathy. We have a harder time feeling what other people are feeling. We have more irritability. Helping people no longer brings a sense of satisfaction for us. It actually becomes more difficult. It's a source of fatigue now rather than true satisfaction when we experience compassion fatigue. Work feels like it's taking away from our personal life, or maybe start to see a blurring between the work we do professionally and our personal worlds. Compassion fatigue usually has a gradual onset, doesn't usually happen immediately the way a trauma does. More likely, compassion fatigue occurs for professionals with larger caseloads and larger work responsibilities. And it also occurs in situations where people are more likely to perceive their workplaces as being unsupportive. So you go back to those earlier slides we looked at, that you have 96% of CEOs saying we're doing enough for mental wellness, and only 69 employees saying we're doing enough for mental wellness. So in that case, employees who have a perception that their workplace is potentially unsupportive for them, this is going to lead to things like compassion fatigue. Let's take that up a notch and go to burnout. So burnout takes it one more sense. With compassion fatigue, we still care. With burnout, according to the definition of burnout, we've pretty much lost hope at that point. When we're burned out, we've lost hope, and especially related to the work that we do. We just don't care anymore. We've lost the energy to care. We are burned out, different than compassion fatigue. People often really feel trapped in their job when they're burned out. They feel like they're in a no-win situation. We become less and less compassionate and empathetic for the people that we serve. We just don't care anymore. And there's no judgment. When we're talking about this, there's no judgment around any of this, but this is the reality of what happens to really caring people when we get to the place where we don't care anymore, and recognizing that there's nothing wrong with us. We are burned out. We are having an experience. And when we recognize the experience that we're having and we can name it, then we can do something about it and stop and hopefully let go of some judgment and some guilt or shame around what we're experiencing, and really kind of look at what were we actually experiencing. And this is why we have these criteria around these things. So burnout, often people feel weighed down by the system that they're in. They feel like they're trapped by the system. They can't do what they need to do or what they want to do because the system doesn't allow it. People start feeling resentful towards their clients and towards their coworkers when they're asked to do something else. Work has become a stressor rather than a source of satisfaction. Again, similar to compassion fatigue, usually has a gradual onset, more likely for professionals with high caseloads and responsibilities, and more likely for people who perceive their workplace as being unsupportive. So these are kind of definitions of compassion fatigue and burnout. I want to share those with you today as we talk about some of the ideas of how we can meet people who are either in fatigue or burnout, or in fatigue on their way to burnout. So let's talk about what are some good, better, and best practices in helping people with these issues, especially when we're talking about going into organizations and working with employers, leaders to help their employees. So let's talk about good. So good would be to address the effects of stress with employees. I really think this is probably one of the best places to start. Now, there's different opinions on this. Depending on who you read, oftentimes they say, wait a second, burnout is the responsibility of the employer, not the employee. And I think there's some relevance to that. But my take is this: if the house is on fire, we don't rush into the house trying to figure out how the fire started. We put out the fire. Like, that's the thing we do first. First, put out the fire, and then figure out the sources of why the fire started. And in organizations right now, the people are on fire, right? The employees are on fire. They're out, they're fatigued, they're burned out, there are mental wellness. We're in a mental wellness crisis right now. The first thing we need to do is help the employees themselves. And employees, by the way, CEOs are also employees. CEOs are employees, managers are employees are employees, right? Everybody within the organization needs to learn actionable tools that affect people at their body systems. I mean, ultimately, stress, whether it's psychological stress, emotional stress, or physical stress, really boils down to physical stress, right? So we're talking about body regulation. Every kind of stress that you can imagine boils down to a dysregulation in someone's physiology. And if you're really interested in this, next week, we'll send you out some information. I'm doing a webinar called De-Stress Anyone in Less Than 5 Minutes. And in that webinar, we're going to go more specifically into what I just said right there, talking about body regulation being the root cause of any other type of stressful issue. And I really believe that if we can make an impact there in body regulation systems, which are these actionable tools with movement, breath work, meditation, mindfulness, and self-massage practices, we can really put out the fire that's happening right now in organizations. So really also important to do some assessments, to know that what we're doing is actually helping. So when we talk about good, when our organizations, when Motivation Beyond Measure goes into other organizations and does our practices, we make an offer to the leaders that we're working with. We say, do you want good, better, or best? And if someone says, we want good, then we say, okay, so this is what we need to do. We need to come in and do some training with your employees to help affect the stress that's happening in their physiology. With that, we need to do some assessments. Let's do a perceived stress scale. Let's get an idea of how stressed out people actually are based on these, based on the tools that we use, so we can do before and after assessing. So how stressed are people in the beginning? We're going to implement our organizational trainings, and then afterwards, we're going to retest. So we want to do stress education, help people understand what stress really is, and then put these actionable tools in place. So that's like the good. Let's get in and let's put out the fire. This is a minimal approach. Do I think it's like where we should stop? No, I think we need to go all the way to best. But this is the entry point for a lot of organizations. And I think it's a really low bar entry point, but super, super important, because the results we get for it are dramatic based on the entry point that we go in at. All right, let's talk about better. So what would better be? So as far as my thinking around this, and look at the literature as well, better is good plus. So we still need to do these employee education programs, help people learn how to regulate their own physiological systems so that they become fireproof essentially. Right? So we want to have employees and we want to become fireproof ourselves so we know what we can do for ourselves. Now, with that said, even if you're fireproof, if you're in an organization that keeps setting you on fire, then it's going to be real hard to stay fireproof. So it's not only the responsibility of the employees, it's a symbiotic relationship between the people that work within the organization and the organization itself. So the first thing we need to do is help empower and resilient individuals. The next thing we need to do is look at the organization itself and address the perceived causes of stress with the leadership. If we go with our fire analogy, we've put out the fire. Now we need to look at the cause of the fire. We need to do some investigation and we need to remediate so that the fire doesn't happen again. This is the better aspect of things. So we do some more assessments, and this time we do more purpose-based assessments. Initially with those perceived stress scales, we're really taking snapshots of how people are operating right now in the world. Next thing we do, take it a little further, we do some purpose-based assessments. The one we like, which has been validated, is motivational mapping. We do motivational mapping, we can get a really good idea of what drives people, what motivates people. We know that purpose, when you look at burnout research, that purpose is one of the, that when people feel on purpose, this is one of the things that makes them burnout proof. I guess you want to look at it that way. So one of the most protective things that an individual can do for burnout is to know they are on purpose and know what their purpose is. And for this, we do motivational mapping. When we do this mapping, we share this mapping with the leadership so they really understand on a very fine details what drives every single person within the organization. They can begin to change their approach with people as individuals to help individuals feel more purposeful as not only individuals, but then grow that into teams and then throughout the whole organization. So we also do what we call all hands-on perceptual education. What that means is to help everyone understand how we perceive things and how we work with our unconscious bias, if you will. So we all operate from unconscious bias, and our biases will create our perceptions. Remember that stress is essentially a perception. When we perceive that we're not able to cope with whatever's going on, we have a physiological and psychological response to that. We can also add emotional in there. So we want to make sure we do some education around that. We find that this education really helps people to let go of guilt and shame around how we process things as human beings. Another really important aspect when we work in organizations is to help people understand their role clarity. So we know that when there's poor role clarity, this is one of the things that really drives stress in an organization. Also, transparency with communicating role clarity and communicating the critical elements that everyone in the organization really needs to know to help them feel more on purpose. So we kind of start to tick these boxes in terms of these are the high drivers of stress and burnout in organizations. Does everyone know their role? Do people know other people's roles? So that there's less comparisonitis that goes on in the organization. We understand what other people's roles are. We can let go some of our comparing in a negative way to one another. All right, we need to look at demand control and effort reward ratios. And so this is really important to bring both CEOs and employees to the table and say, what are the role clarity? So again, what's the role clarity? So what are the demands that go along with this role clarity, and how much control do people have that are in comparison with those demands? We know that demand control is one of the massive drivers of stress when those are out of balance. We also know effort reward ratios. When people feel like they're giving more effort and getting less reward back, that also really drives stress and burnout. So we want to make sure that those ratios are transparent and understood within the organization, because if they are, that will lower the potential for burnout to occur or for that fire to start again. Autonomy, we look at how autonomous are people's choices. Autonomy can be things like flex hours, work from home, but there's lots of different ways to have autonomy. People can schedule their own, again, work hours during the day. Maybe people during the day have the autonomy to take work breaks. Maybe they have the autonomy to initiate certain activities in their job processes. Here's the thing, the autonomy must be perceived by the employee. It must be perceived by the employee. That's the really important part. Like someone else can look from the outside, and to me, that's not autonomy, but it matters to the person whether they feel like they are autonomous. And if they do, that will again lower the contagion of stress within the organization. And then, of course, leadership awareness training. So we really do leadership awareness. So this is really critical, again, for this better phase. Management and leadership, understanding a little bit more about what drives people, how to implement motivational mapping in real time with people, how to see that there's a problem brewing without it getting too large, how to basically come in there and address those problems early. This is all around leadership awareness training. It goes much deeper than that, but that's just a quick overview of it. So far we have good and we have better. Now let's go on to best. So best is, well, we do good again. So we're talking about looking at employees' capacity to regulate themselves, their own physiological capacities. Better, we look at perceived causes of stress with the leadership and we do some work around that. Now, best is where we want to take this even deeper. And we really start looking at building a sustainable wellness culture, mental wellness culture. So how do we go about doing that? It's really important in this situation to continue to do regular reassessments of whatever reassessments that we did going in. Our organization, we do perceived stress scales and of course motivational mapping, and we want to do those regularly throughout. So we're always getting pulse checks and touch points with the organizations that we're working with. And this can be done in either small or large organizations, which we're going to look at in just a moment. Continue leadership training, because people move up the scale. So we're talking about leadership pipeline training. We're talking about succession planning for leaderships. And as we just noted at the bottom of this, we're talking about new employee indoctrination as well. So as people change roles and positions, we need to continue to work on training to help people understand the core elements of mental wellness. We want to do coaching support for all levels. So we offer coaching banks for organizations where certain times during the coaching office hour or coaching hour banks, so people can get support going right through. Because again, just because we put trainings and implementations in place doesn't mean that people are able to run with them independently right away. We still need to be coaching and working with people to continue rooting out some of these perceived causes of stress that are problematic. We do strategic advising. So again, at the best level, strategic advising, moving what other programs can we implement? What other things can we do moving forward? Working with CEOs and with leadership is really important, and also continuing to help people with internal communication. So keeping those communication lines open between the leadership and between the people within the organizations. Decreases siloing, which means people feel less disconnected within the organizations. And to create a culture, a common language culture throughout, so that people can really, again, lower levels of guilt, shame, and make vulnerability not such a so that vulnerability doesn't feel like a liability. Remember, we looked at CEOs who are essentially saying that if I'm vulnerable, that's a liability. It lowers my capacity to be seen as a leader or my capabilities. Well, the likelihood that actually goes throughout the whole organization is very good. So it's not just the leadership, it's also the employees within the organization also are less likely to want to be vulnerable. But we know that the more human we are, the more human we can be, the more it lowers our levels of burnout and lowers our levels of stress, okay? Because it creates more connection, less disconnection. So all of these things are really important in creating a culture of sustainable mental wellness moving forward. So we have good, we have better, and we have best. Now, let's just look really quickly at the ROI. What's the return on investment for mental wellness programs? So this was a PricewaterhouseCoopers report. I just want to walk you through some key bullet points on this. So when mental health conditions present substantial cost organizations, okay? So when we actually go in and do really like good, better, best work, we know that it's about a 2.3 ROI, and that means that for every dollar spent on successfully implementing an appropriate mental wellness action, there is a return of $2.30 in benefits to be gained by the organization. So for every $1 spent, you get $2.30 back. Okay, so you're doubling your investment, a little bit better than doubling your investment when we talk about mental wellness programs. Now, these benefits typically take the form of improved productivity, reduced absenteeism and presenteeism, and they lower the number of compensation claims. So that's the places that we see the beneficial cost loss happen at, with the productivity, absenteeism, and compensation claims primarily, okay? It's really important to think about the size of the organizations. What the PricewaterhouseCoopers report showed is that typically the higher ROIs actually come back for smaller organizations. And that's because the single most critical success factor is an employee participation. Duh. Right? I mean, if people aren't doing the things, if everyone isn't participating, we're not going to get the effect that we need to. And they find that it's been easier to get people to participate in smaller organizations. The work around here for larger organizations is to implement in teams. So to start with pilot programs, so if you have a large organization like Apple or Google or something, to start on a specific small team to implement the good, better, and best within the team itself, and then grow it from there, so that we're not trying to take a whole bite of the big organization. We actually take smaller bites as we go in and work in little bits at a time. They've seen that we get higher payback on the ROI when we do it in that way. Because again, the single most critical factor is whether or not people are actually participating and actually doing the work with it. And there is so thanks for hanging in there with me for our presentation today. I'm looking forward to doing some roundtabling now and having some discussion about what we've presented, what we've laid out here.